Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kolisa Philip from the Africa Report. I'd like to do something unconventional and ask you to do one thing for us for a second. Can you please take out your wallets and show us? Because today we're going to talk about a topic that touches every individual person. You don't have your wallets here today? Come, show. Can you please just raise your wallet? Yes. The African consumer. So, in sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, over the past 2 years, inflation has risen at a double-digit pace. As this happens, about 40% of our incomes in the continent goes towards buying consumer goods. So this morning, as we discuss this topic and how to tackle some of the shocks on the supply side, as well as on the demand side, on the consumers' pockets, we're going to have Stefano Niavas from the Boston Consulting Group talk us through, from an expert's point of view, how the lay of the land stands before we go into the discussion on the topic. Take it away, Stefano.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Thank you for answering. So I'm told I was the expert, but I'm just setting the scene before the real experts can have a panel here. And so this is a very topical topic that we have to cover today about the African consumer and how to manage the inflation. So why are we talking about this in Africa, you may ask, right? Because if you think in many of our African markets, we are actually used to inflation. There is always inflation. Actually, even every time I work with my colleagues from another part of the world, I like, please don't forget to factor inflation. I know there is no inflation in your market, but in my markets, there is inflation. So why are we talking about it now? What has changed? What has changed is that actually, even if we're used to it, this time around, we are facing some very high levels of inflation. So in South Africa, it's 10-year high, Nigeria 20-year high, Ethiopia 10-year high, Morocco 20-year high. So we are really talking about something that is unprecedented for many people who are operating on the continent. And if we look at the price, to look at some data, if you look at the CPG, the Consumer Price Indexes in Sub-Saharan Africa, year over year, last year Q2 and this year Q2, we're talking 17% increase, we're talking 20% increase. So those are massive numbers. And what is driving inflation? There are many things behind inflation, but we're just going to pick three things that are important. So currency devaluation. Why is it important? We import a lot of things, and we have sustained heavy devaluation. Nigeria, South Africa. So when we put those numbers up, when we did this presentation, South Africa was 25%. I think now it's 40% against the dollar. I checked this morning. So those are massive numbers that have direct impact on cost. Supply chain disruption. With COVID, there were a lot of things that were not getting to the markets, and that again, when you have shortages, what do? You increase the price to regulate demand. And rising production costs, again, the price of energy, for instance, as we all know, went up, or you have electricity shortages in some of our markets. So all those are things that are driving inflation. But again, you look at the double-digit numbers, and you're like, is it important? Is it high? Yes, you think it's high, but let's conceptualize this a bit. If you think about what consumers spend, 40% on average in sub-Saharan market of the income of any consumers is spent on food. So you could also say, it's 40%, so I'm left with 60%. So actually I can increase it maybe 45, 50 to be able to eat, but not necessarily, because in the balance you have transportation, you need to go to work, right? You have housing, you need to live somewhere. You have education, it's very important because you don't want your kids to feel the way you felt if you don't have enough money. And you have also health. So what can you really cut on in order to be able to feed yourself? And then why is it even more difficult is that when you look at those price increases and you look at what people are earning, CPG prices increase twice faster than people's earnings. So actually you really find yourself in a crunch. So what can you do? That's what we're going to talk about on this panel, but a few things that typical consumer goods companies are doing on the continent to manage that. So first of all, they are companies, so they need to manage their margins. So sometimes they actually have to defend their margin, but some of the levers, the good old cost structure. So, you find a way to reduce your marketing spend, your supply chain spends, etc. But also things like portfolio management. So you actually reduce the type of products that you sell, so you go for lower prices so that people can afford things that you have on your portfolio. Or the good old, net revenue management. What do we mean? So one of the examples is you sell something, today it's 20 grams for 10 nairas, tomorrow is 18 grams for 10 nairas, the day after tomorrow is 15 grams for 10 nairas, and then you realize, okay, now I went a bit far, so what do I do? Now I'm going to do maybe 30 grams, and it's going to be 20 nairas, and I start all over again. So those are the types of levers that consumer goods companies are using, and it's very similar to what consumers are doing. We did a survey a couple of months ago, and actually consumers are saying that they are skipping meals. So I think it was 1/3 of the consumers over the markets that we are talking about, but that we are surveying, that said that they were skipping meals. So this is one way to manage your portfolio down, or actually you go for cheaper food. But then the other, if you want to do something more drastic, then you need to attack the full value chain of food system. So this is an eye chart. Don't try to read all of it. It's very complex. The food system is a very complex value chain. What can we do to change? That takes time, but you need to work on every part of the value chain. In production, we need to increase the yields. We have some of the lower yields in the world. In processing, we need to increase our level of processing. A lot of the things that are consumed on the continent are processed somewhere else. If we are processing them locally, we can also get away with this devaluation I was talking about before. Reducing your distribution costs, your storage costs, and then consumption. Do we need to consume what is consumed all over the world, or should we consume something that is more local, that is more to our taste? So those are the things that I guess the panel are going to talk about. And so there are three teams for this panel today. So thinking about those input costs, inevitable or avoidable, to pass them through to the consumer. Can we do something to be more efficient on distribution and retail? And also, what are the policies that can be put in place to do something on rising costs?
Thank you, Stefano, for that presentation. Now, before we go into the Q&A with our panelists, I'd like to introduce them. To my right, we've got Jacques Vermeulen from South Africa. He's the CEO of Coca-Cola Beverages Africa. His company covers quite a substantial outlay in the region. And then next to him is Tara Nathan. She's the Executive Vice President, Community Pass at MasterCard. And then we've also got Kadi Konediko. She's a senior partner at Amethyst. Now, we've also got Stefano, obviously, who you've been introduced to, and entering the stage is Farouk Gumel from Nigeria. He's the Executive Director and Vice Chairman Africa at the TGI Group. So I'm going to first start off by asking, passing on the cost, the rising input costs to African consumers. Is it inevitable? Is it avoidable? Let's start with you, Jacques, and then Tara, Kadi, and then Farouk.
Good morning, everyone. CCBA, or Coca-Cola Beverages Africa, is doing about 40% of the volume on the continent of Africa for the Coca-Cola company. We employ 17,000 employees, and we service 680 outlets, so a very broad consumer base, so we understand the pressure that consumers are under. In the last couple of years with the pandemic and geopolitical unrest and high inflation, we did manage to grow our volume in an environment where the consumers are very constrained, as well as the continent is constrained for growth as well. And then the recent commodity cost increases was exorbitant, so we did pass on some of the cost increases to our consumer base. So to answer your question, I would say it was unavoidable to not pass on some of the cost increases.
All right, Tara, can you please come in there?
So it's interesting, right, when we talk about consumer costs. I think that's sort of the end of the value chain. If you go to the front of the value chain, you have the smallholder farmer who's responsible for 80% of the production of the food that is consumed here, represents 60% of the labor force across sub-Saharan Africa. And, you know, they have the double whammy of not only being a consumer who's facing these rising consumer costs, but frankly, as a manufacturer or as a business person, they face the challenge of rising input prices. And this is creating incredible margin compression for them and making it impossible for them to actually make a living. I think in order to address it, is it avoidable? I think it is avoidable. We got to address the causes of what is causing the price challenges for that farmer, right? We talked about inefficiencies in the supply chain. Right now, if you look at the agricultural supply chain, it's incredibly paper-based, very manual, very expensive. Up to, depending on the value chain, you have up to 40% of post-harvest loss. So food being produced is just being dumped, right? If you can save that, we could pass those savings on to the farmer. When we talk about rising seeds and input prices for the smallholder farmer, the challenge is the farmers are forced to make suboptimal decisions. So sitting in the field, they don't have access to $100, $60 to $100 worth of credit to buy the appropriate seed that would give them the optimal yields. You mentioned suboptimal yields as being one of the principal causes of consumer prices rising. If we're able to enable credit to the smallholder farmer in these small denominations, they can actually buy seeds that are appropriate, that have the optimal yield, that can actually increase production. So these are all some of the simple things that can happen if we actually address these causes of, of some of the challenges, I think, upstream.
All right, thanks, Tara. I mean, the supermarket aisle has become a place of dread for many African consumers. They have to make the competing consideration. Should I buy food? Should I buy hygiene products? Should I buy cleaning products? Which one becomes a priority because of the scale and the pace at which price increases have been affected? Are these inevitable, Kadi? Are these avoidable? She's going to speak in French for those who don't understand.
Thank you, Solisa. Yes, actually, I decided to switch in French because I see a lot of my compatriots here. I'm from Côte d'Ivoire, and I'm very pleased to have you. So you don't need to use your headset here for me.
So at Amethyst, we invested both in manufacturers of fast-moving consumer goods and producers as well, in two supermarket groups that are leaders in the countries, Naivas in Kenya and CDCI in Côte d'Ivoire. And what I can say is that for the retailer has to pass through the inflation cost to the consumer. He has to, in part, because with the right investments and with the right strategy, he can limit these costs being passed through the consumer. But he has to, in a way, because basically if you look at the costs of a retailer, you have the product itself, which is the product that he purchases from his suppliers, the vendors are impacted by inflation, so he has to pay a higher price. And that product, if it's an imported one, there's what Stefano was mentioning, there's also the Forex, the exchange rate, a local currency, US dollar, or local currency, euro, which is impacted, and there's also the cost of transportation. So that's a first component of the price of the product. There's also the cost of logistics for the supermarket group because they have to both supply the supermarkets, they have to manage inventory in the warehouses, which is a third cost. There's labor also, and the cost of energy. So on some segments, it's rather difficult to limit costs being passed through the consumers. On other segments, we have initiatives that we see coming up. We have initiatives on the product side, doing what you were describing, saying that when you take a supermarket such as Naivas in Kenya, what we are able to do, because we have an industrial tissue that is rather strong, 90% of the products in these supermarkets are local products. that are gotten from 1,700 local suppliers. So this is a natural solution to inflation and increase in logistics costs. So what was interesting is that we had 70% also local products at CDCI in Côte d'Ivoire. We haven't reached the 90% of the supermarket in Kenya, but it's rather a positive figure because it's a different trend if you compare that to the classic supermarkets where you have more imported goods than exported goods. So the second thing on the product side that is very important is what CDCI from Côte d'Ivoire developed, which is the semi-wholesale, which allows them to get the margin from the retailer and then have it benefit the consumer. So that is a strategy that is used by the supermarket groups in order to limit inflation. But another important thing, which is something that we help the companies we invest in do, is to create a logistical platform. At NIVAS, the difficulty when we arrived was that most of the suppliers were supplying the different supermarket networks, roughly 60 supermarkets. So we had logistics costs that were borne by the supplier, and it was passed through the price. So we have a platform for logistics that mutualizes the costs and reduce the cost of the products sold in the supermarket, and that is going to allow, at the end of the day, the supermarket group to have products that are more affordable at prices that are less affected by inflation for the consumer. So you have different strategies. That is on the side where we decide how we can choose products that allow us to pay a lower price and also have a logistical base that allows us to have an increased efficiency to fight against inflation for the consumer.
Farouk, I mean, you come from a very interesting market in Nigeria. Many of the dynamics that Kadi touched upon, the structural factors, inefficient logistic chains, imported inflation because of the imported goods aspect. But you are at a very interesting interface in Nigeria. Can you talk to the fact that are these price increases inevitable for all of us as we're sitting here in this room, or is it avoidable? Can FMCGs be more creative in their approach?
Thank you. And my apologies for being late. I was at a breakfast meeting that ran. But this is a very interesting topic, but it's something that we always look at on a daily basis in my group. The difference is I'm lucky enough to control most of my value chain. So, for example, we do many things. And if we take the agricultural value chain of my company, for example, we produce seeds, we do fertilizer, and we do the agrochemicals. Then we go to the communities and we create our own cooperatives. So we now capture the farmers and lend to them the inputs. We now provide them with vocational training and services to teach them, extension services to teach them the best techniques, not technology, techniques. Because when you start to put technology into rural economies, you are creating unemployment. The more tractors you put down, the less people that will work. Because you need one tractor driver, but you probably need 18 people to work that hectare. So we try and use techniques to capture people on site, and they work. Once they harvest, our factories now come with a guaranteed offtake agreement. So my input supply business has sold to the farmers, has lent to the farmers. When my factory comes, it pays the farmers, and the farmers pays back the input company. The factory now goes and processes these items. Now, obviously, we have some items that come into the value chain that we don't control. Maybe the bagging facilities, etc. Sorry, the sacks or the casings that we put our products in. Once the factory finishes processing, then our distribution company now buys from the factory. And they are now responsible to get the product to the consumers in the urban centers. So we have a rural-based business. We have a semi-urban-based business in the processing side, and then we have an urban-focused business in the distribution and marketing side. Now, what we did recently as well, taking into account we cannot carry this burden alone, is we also went ahead and bought a bank. And so our bank now has started to work with our our agri-input business, getting some of our agro dealers to become agent bankers. So those people in the rural economy who in the past had no access to banking facilities, because we all talk about tech and efficiencies of tech. But if I'm sitting 200 kilometers away from the biggest city I know, and there's no bank, you can't tell me to go on an app that my money is there. Because all the markets I operate in are cash and carry type system. So we've now started to engage our agents and ensure that they've now become a semi-bank branch in those communities, so that people can deposit and withdraw. You now get them to start to borrow from those agents. And luckily enough for us, so far, touch wood, we've done a close to 99.6% recovery, which means the default rates are very low. Now back to your question about passing costs. It's inevitable to pass costs. But what cost are you passing? Because we still have not defined cost. Cost is about if you want to have an inclusive system, you have to be inefficient in Africa. Efficiency is something that we discuss in urban centers, but in rural areas, to be inclusive, to create a rural economy where people are employed, where people earn in an unskilled, uneducated environment, you have to be inefficient. That inefficiency pays back in security. Your assets are protected. Your wealth is protected because people are active. And if you have security, you are saving costs. The next thing is you now look at those things that you don't control. Packaging, for example, quality of product. You are not compromising on quality in terms of people will get unhealthy, but you are compromising on affordability. Is this packaging necessary? We have a marketing team that is constantly looking at our packaging. What ink should I use? What colors should I use? What type of raw material should I use to even make the bag? How do I reduce that cost? Where do I advertise? If I'm selling to the urban consumer, do I go digital? Do I do print? Do I go TV? Do I go radio? Because a lot of these costs actually happen at the back end when you come to get that product to the consumer. But if you have a story about that product, that this product has created thousands of jobs, the consumer will naturally get attracted to it. And we also ensure that we have partners as well. So we work very closely with all the development agencies, in my country at least. Some of them give us grants, some of them give us training, some of them give us both. And we try to ensure that we lower our cost of production, but we also lower our cost of distribution while controlling the financing aspect of it. It's inevitable, but it's controllable.
All right. I mean, nosing in on that point, for you, Tara, I know that you're quite, passionate about efficiencies, distribution networks, as well as some of the retail value chain. And you've mentioned something about, agricultural supply chain. Where can modernization, where is it needed to protect the cost of the consumer whilst at the same time protecting the incomes of the smallholder farmer who themselves, you say, are consumers? And then I'm going to come to you, Jacques, and then Kadi, and then we'll end off with Farouk.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on a couple of the points that the other panelists made. I think the quick answer to me is digitalization. So some of the platforms that Kadi mentioned, that Farouk mentioned, I think
You put your mic up.
can bring incredible efficiencies to the agricultural supply chain. The challenge is, as Farouk mentioned, at the last mile in many of the markets where the farmers operate, they're largely operating in offline contexts. So over 60% of the people don't have connectivity to actually employ digital platforms or solutions. Depending on the demographic and depending on the geography, upwards of 30 to 40% don't have an identity, don't have any kind of digital identity or a way except for maybe a village elder saying, this is farmer so-and-so, to actually identify who they are to avail of services. So these are some of the, I think, strongholds of, or some of the challenges or obstacles to engaging with digital. Community Pass at MasterCard is something where we actually seek to partner with the platforms that you mentioned, that Farouk mentioned, to enable local African ag techs, fintechs, financial institutions to deliver services to these farmers and to these various supply chain actors by enabling digital identity and by enabling the digitization of the ag value chain, but to happen offline. And by enabling this to happen offline, what we've seen is we're actually able to create synergies and to create an ecosystem where, for those food manufacturers who don't have the benefits of being completely vertically integrated or having complete, control over the entire value chain, they can avail of some of the benefits that Farouk mentioned, right? Which is access to credit, access to quality, low-cost inputs, access to efficient markets, because that's a big thing, right? It's every time they produce the produce, do they have buyers on the other side to actually purchase that offtake? And these are some of the things that digitalization can address.
All right, thank you, Tara. On that point, I mean, Jacques, could you make a distinction among the 15 markets where you operate as it relates to the opportunities there as well as the constraints when it comes to optimizing efficiencies?
Thanks, Talisa. Yeah, look, we have a very clear strategy to grow all of our markets from a growth perspective across our business. But at the same time, we're also looking at driving efficiencies across the value chain, which is a crucial, important piece for us. And efficiency links to what are we offering our consumer base. And a lot of our initiatives are driven around how do we make our products more affordable? How do we create a price point that's attractive and relevant for our consumer base? And that's one of the key driving forces for us in terms of initiatives, but also driving a very strong focus on our value chain. One of the key things, if you look at distribution, is we really believe that we need to have a segmented, market-specific solution for distribution, where we incorporate the needs of our customers as well as our needs of a business efficiency and provide this across the end. So from our consumer right through where we're ordering raw materials, try and streamline that process. One of the key benefits for us in Africa is digitalization, to the point that you're making. And we're investing in digitalization, not because we believe in tech, but because we have to operate in a digital world. And that's the key piece for us to drive data, automation, and also be part of the real-time expectation of our consumer base. And what we're doing is specifically investing really around the whole value chain, an economic or tech stack that effectively caters from consumer right through the value chain so that we become more efficient, but we incorporate others to become more efficient as well in that space. And this technology will enable us to become far more data-driven and the latest AI-informed in terms of our decision-making, our speed of decision-making, so that we can become more proactive across the value chain and we can play a role. As part of this role, and I'm linking back to what you said as well, is how do we play a role around building capabilities broader than just our network or our value chain? And how do we empower our people to be able to be part and connecting into our network that we've built from a digital perspective? So what we're trying to do is to provide more options to route to market for our customer base, and at the same time protecting the existing route to market options that we have, but also forging different partnerships. And in that partnerships, we can bring more people into the play. And then for our consumers, we're hoping and we're trying to connect far better with our consumer base than what we've done up to now. And that's a constant evolution so that we can become more personal to our consumers when we supply a cold, refreshing Coca-Cola.
Thanks, Jacques. Kadi, I mean, are there any benefits to supply side efficiencies for the African consumer?
Parce qu'en fait, yes, indeed. You see, the supermarkets groups are in a sector that is extremely competitive as of today. There are quite a lot of supermarket branches. And the truth is, if they have the ability to get a better handle on their costs, it's easier for them to have a better margin without having to raise the prices. And this really highlights the importance of this efficiency in order to better handle inflation and not have this have an impact on the consumer. Now, there are two aspects that are quite important talking about efficiency. First of all, as Tara said, digitalization. When you look at the supermarket of Naivas in Kenya, what we've established is a system of card for fidelity of clients, and it allows us to analyze data, and it also allows us to target promotion of products from the producers. Now, it creates a real partnership between supermarket and the producers, which indicates that, for example, okay, maybe we don't have to promote some product as opposed to others, maybe toward the end of the month or something. So we have the ability to identify what is important. So at this point, we know, for example, that at a certain point in time, maybe at some point during the month, there is maybe the client will receive their money, their salary, so it's easier for them to afford some other type of products. So we can make a lot of adjustments. We can minimize the cost of marketing also for the producer, and it creates a real partnership between the producer and the supermarket to be able to adjust prices and find a way to provide a good offer for the consumer. And this is something that we've done, and we've seen the impact of digitalization as part of data collection and also as part of promotion of the offer for the consumer. And it allowed us also to limit food waste and also improving rotation of stocks. So this is an investment that is quite significant for corporation, but we believe it is necessary, it is important for you to be more efficient. Now, the second element is the modernization of the platforms. Now, it's not as easy as it sounds. When you're in Kenya, where you see that you have a large group of producers that allow you to have local products, that's a good thing, but you do not have all of those that are as part of a production system that is automated. You know, the picture that we have of this chain of production that is really oiled up and functioning smoothly is not exactly what is there. So in order for us to suggest prices that are interesting, you need to focus on these local producers. Now, as part of this modernization, there is an investment that is quite significant, and we're glad that we have investment funds like Ametis and others that participate in the investment when it comes to these type of logistical platform. But there is also a significant thinking that needs to happen on how to modernize the platform by also integrating African particularities. Like in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, here we don't have really that type of problem because we already had supermarkets that were already present. They already had some pallets, so everything was organized in such a way that the logistical platform was modernized to a certain point. And we need to find ways to do so by minimizing the cost, the logistical cost and cost as a whole. And it allows us also to not have to raise prices and at the same time be able to get a significant margin and find ways to present really good prices to the consumers.
I'd also like Stefano, when we end off on Farouk, to come in terms of the different Africas and this modernization drive and what you have seen emerge in terms of trends. Because some argue that, you know, putting this together in the African context is like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle because the contexts are so different. But Farouk, you mentioned something very interesting about strategic inefficiencies having to be weighed against modernizing. What are you doing in that regard in Nigeria?
Well, like I said, digitization technology is fantastic in urban areas, fantastic in organized retail. But in rural areas like where we operate, where we have our factories, and it's not only in Nigeria, we have factories in Benin Republic, etc., it's very difficult. Let me give you an example. 6 months ago, we decided to do a financial inclusion drive for our farmers. to open bank accounts for them. But the first thing we did was we partnered with the National Identity Management Agency to give our farmers birth certificates. So imagine giving a 67-year-old a birth certificate for the first time. So we had a setup in the village head's palace. The guys came in and queued up. It's all in the media. What's your name? How old do you think you are? You know, what's your address? There. You know. And then we started from there. And then there's a witness that confirms this guy is roughly here. So it's like 1st July 1952, 2nd August 1953 kind of thing. And then you now move to the next layer where there's a witness, a local government official, and a certificate is stamped by the local government. Then you now pass it to the Identity Management Agency, who now have a government document that confirms that this guy is approximately this age and roughly lives there. Then he now has a national ID card. And imagine the look on their faces when they get that paper. It's printed there in front of them. They now get that document and then they move to the next desk, which is our bank. And then congratulations, you have a bank account. And it's amazing the kind of monies they were depositing. We had someone who literally deposited $7,000 in the middle of nowhere, the equivalent of $7,000, into a bank account. And we were all shocked. But they are farmers. So the assumption is because they dress rough, they don't speak English, they don't have documentation that they're poor. And we can't just assume like that, because they are also proud people, they have their own economy. Right? So the fact is, if I now come and meet this guy and I say, you know what, download this app, get this thing from Amazon, it will be delivered to your door, there's a microwave, you can do this. Then we've now gone to the moon. I mean, this is like, you know. So we kept it simple there, and we kept it, that's their own digitization, that's their own technology. Maybe their kids will now have a better life because their parents are formal. And already we've started. We're creating rice academies, we're creating sesame academies, because even if you're doing it manually, maybe your technique is archaic. Maybe you don't have to space it 2 meters. Maybe you can just do half a meter. But then you have higher yields. Then your son will now come and say, you know what, I want to use a tractor. And then his son will be working in a factory. So now you have this guy who has 5 hectares as opposed to half a hectare, and then you now continuously start to evolve. Like you said, it's an evolutionary process. You cannot leapfrog reality. There's an urban Africa, there's a rural Africa, and we're hovering in between, but we have to customize the needs of the urban man, tailored for the urban man, the needs of the rural consumer, tailored to the rural consumer. It is our job to make sure that bridge exists. We cannot take what was done in the US, we cannot take what was done in Singapore and try to bring it to Nigeria. Lagos is Nigeria, Kebbi is Nigeria, but they are 2 separate Nigerias. They have nothing to do with each other. Kebbi supplies rice to Lagos, Lagos eats the rice. That's the connection.
Thank you, Farouk. The many Africas, Stefano.
Yeah, so first of all, can you hear me? Yeah. So on the, first of all, back to the cost inevitable, avoidable, my 2 cents, inevitable. And as Farouk said, at the same time, if you take a long-term view, you can manage it. Because you can actually work on those supply chains to reduce those costs, adapt what people are eating, adapt the way we're doing it. It may be inefficient at the beginning, but in the end, we can prevail. On the supply chain inefficiencies or efficiencies, actually there are so many differences in Africa. We always, as usual, we talk about Africa, but I think we're the only continent that talks about the continent. Anyone else talks about their country. But that's where we are. We are still small, so we have to do it. Because as Farouk said, within Nigeria there are already so many differences. But if we just look at retail, for instance, if you think about South Africa, for products that you sell in South Africa, anything between 50 and sometimes 98% is sold in a retail store. If you go to Nigeria, I think at best you say 1% is sold in a retail store when you're on a good day. Everything else is traditional trade. So when you think about efficiencies, you have to think about it very differently. You can do some very advanced digital AI efficiency work in South Africa, to optimize the prices that Kadi was talking about. In South Africa, you can have a machine optimizing your base price. Those are type of things that we see retailers do in South Africa. The same for promotions, the same for logistics. In Nigeria, you don't have a retailer to start that with. So when you think about efficiencies, you're thinking about something very different. Still, there are some things that are going across. If you still talk to a South African retailer, they will tell you, look, I have a very fundamental problem, is that I'm trying to put this thing on promo, but actually they cannot supply. So what do I do now? Do I cut the promo? Do I not do it? Why do I tell people I don't have the product, but then they will be riots? So how do I do that? Or maybe I need to stock way more than what everybody else does. So then you look at their stock level and you don't understand, compared to the rest of the world, it's super high. Yeah, because nobody can provide the goods, so I need to stock higher, back to your inefficiency points. And again, if you look at Nigeria, then you cannot, you have the same things where there is shortages left, right, and center, and everything is about availability. So we can do better, but there are very different realities across the continent.
All right. Thank you for that, Stefano. I mean, before we go to our last point, the IMF estimates that our inflation in the region is at decades high. It's at double-digit levels. And the dangers or the vulnerabilities that creates is that there is a macroeconomic as well as a social aspect to some of these vulnerabilities. In a post-COVID environment where Africa has struggled to recover in terms of economic growth, in terms of the rates at which we create jobs, and as well as in the context of a high inflationary environment, some of which is imported inflation. The African supply chain was shown up as vulnerable during the COVID shutdowns when we were one of the few regions in the world where there were so many bottlenecks and everything was redirected, to other regions in the world. And that highlighted the imperative for some to argue that regional integration is an important component to consider in order to mitigate some of the supply side as well as these demand side shocks. So from that perspective, Tara, what kinds of regional policies would encourage, digitalization as well as greater integration in order to ease some of these, constraints on the African consumer? Then I'll come to you, Jean.
I mean, I think there are a number of policies and that are emerging sort of across the continent. When you think about whether it's Smart Africa, sort of at a continent-wide level, if you look at various nations building out domestic ICT policies. So I think there's a lot of focus on driving competition, which is good because that drives down cost for the consumer. It drives innovation and sort of a lot of focus on the benefits of digital for the markets. I think there are policies that, on the flip side, perhaps, while perhaps well-intentioned, may be having adverse implications or adverse outcomes to what they're intending, like things like on-soil data requirements. Okay, there's a lot of policies that are emerging now around forcing things to happen on soil, and I think the concern is that imposes a huge cost to companies who are trying to leverage digital to drive cost efficiencies down to the consumer, and that's having the adverse impact of actually rising prices, frankly, on the consumer, or in the worst case scenario, sometimes companies have to shut down or leave low-income segments or low-income markets.
All right. Thank you, Tara. So, Jacques, how can some of the optimal policy design cushion the supply side effect as well as the demand side cost spillovers?
Yeah, I think if you look at Africa specific and the recent development around the huge inflation, geopolitical again, the supply chain disruptions that we're experiencing, and then the slowdown in economic growth, and then also the slowdown in development, there's really a room for far stronger level of integration on a regional basis. Our experience with the African Free Trade Agreement that 54 countries in Africa signed is that it's exactly that, it is signed. And there's a huge room for us and for governments to start implementing that process, because we're still seeing a very one-sided utilization of own policies to protect local sourcing instead of driving a far stronger level of regionalization in that process. So we would hope for a policy harmonization. We would hope for a legal framework that will help us to identify common principles that we can work on and really create a standard and custom processes and tariff liberalization and taxes and intellectual property rights that we can protect those, but that we as regions in Africa can start supporting each other to be able to drive a far stronger level regional integration, because for companies like us, we can then really develop a far stronger, robust investment profile. We can really invest far stronger across regions to strengthen our value chain and through that drive employment. And I do get it. I mean, I think there's a huge protection of national interest versus a regional collaboration, but it's something that Africa needs to step over, and it's something that Africa needs to step in. The other point that I want to raise is one of the bigger drivers for cost in Africa for the consumer is tax. We need a far more stronger visibility and a robust tax regulation. In some of our markets, we pay taxes equivalent to 50% of our revenue. Now imagine what corporates can do from an investment perspective and an employment perspective if those taxes are becoming reasonable. And one of the huge negatives for Africa is the exorbitant and unpredictability around regulation. At the moment, as we come out of the pandemic and as we come out of the war and the consequences of the war that's happened with Russia and Ukraine, there's an enormous new taxes that's been introduced across Africa. Those are all detrimental to business and business investment views and strategies. When business invests, they invest for 20 years. This is not a one-year investment. And suddenly to find yourself in an environment where you have regulatory drives that change the scope for you going forward adds an enormous cost to businesses. And there's a huge opportunity for government in Africa to be far more transparent and far more medium, longer term outlook, so that we try and reduce or build a far stronger and effective tax system across the continent. That will really motivate corporates to invest far more aggressively in their value chains and in the communities of Africa.
Kadi, the role of policy in the regions as well as in the national context?
Alors, je suis totalement en ligne avec Jacques.
So I am in complete agreement with Jacques. When you look at what we were talking about, we wanted to limit inflation by, first of all, having local products, consume local product, because it's a natural edge compared to, based on forex and logistical costs and the freight costs. So to consume locally, we need to have strong industries. And one of the very first constraint of industries everywhere, and it's pretty much the same thing whether we're talking about Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, or South Africa, is the weight of taxes. So if we're talking about wanting to support the local industry and not carrying out any sort of financial incentive, then it's hypocritical. We need to have a taxation system that is transparent, that is not the result of exchanges and a lot of discussion with the fiscal administration. We need to have everything be as transparent as possible and make sure that it allows us to develop and push the industry further, because sometimes it weighs a little too much on very small producers, and Africa does need regional and national champions in the matter of production. And I genuinely believe that this is the key element to have a proper taxation system. Now, the second element, it's something that we touched upon a little when we talk about policies and initiatives to manage inflation. We think about the price setting because but we need to be very careful about that, because we see that in some countries in the region, when prices are capped at a certain point, it sometimes creates a shortage of said food that is imported, and it's usually felt by the producers of cattle. And this then has an impact on all of the other producers, because they see that they can have maybe fewer chickens, fewer chicks. It had an impact on poultry as a whole, because they do not have enough feed for those. So the capping of the price needs to be done in a smart way. And as you were saying, when we talk about inflation, it is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just in Africa. And we see a lot of initiative. I believe in some countries there was a moment where they allowed in things to be fairly easy going on the food side. Now what we're trying to focus on is that the state, for example, would not set prices on specific products, but it would allow the producers to have a sort of a basket of product that they would choose themselves. So from one distributor to the other it would change, but then they commit to cap the price on maybe a single trimester, and then we can wait and see the repercussions of that. So when we look at the different initiatives, the policies that we can implement to really limit inflation, I believe there is, first of all, developing a production, encourage a local production. Secondly, mitigates the impact of taxes. Also encourage investment in the industrial sector and processing sector. It can be done through the investment of stakeholders. For example, we have the CNPS, which is a pension fund here in Côte d'Ivoire. So encourage investment through these entities, and encourage the people that work in industries and allow them to carry out modernization on digitalization, but also on other platforms, and also find ways to take measures to set and cap prices, but in conversation with the other stakeholders.
We have 5 minutes. So, Farouk, I mean, we've long been told that it's the decade of Africa. Africa's moment has arrived. But it seems as though it's almost destiny delayed, because the policy architecture in the region is quite fragmented. We keep trying to integrate, but, in terms of articulating that position, we're quite good at it. But in terms of implementing it, where are we and how can this help? And can you just, when you make your point, can you just be brief? We'd like to give the audience an opportunity to also engage with you.
Probably going to get into trouble for this, but so which Africa? We have African leaders and policymakers. We have African businesses. The policymakers put policies. The businesses take the brunt of the business, take the brunt of the policies. But nobody engages the Africans. Policymakers and government and institutions. The businesses that take these policies are institutions. But if you go to any African today, your average African, and talk to him about, we have a free trade agreement, he will be shocked, because he already trades freely, cross-border, using Newton's law of smuggling. So, because it's gravity, things just move. So when you now go to those border communities and you start to say, now I'm bringing a policy to formalize what you've been doing for hundreds of years, he will laugh at you, because nobody has engaged them. Go to Seme. Back then, we used to drive from Nigeria to Cotonou, right? And we go with our passports and our documents, our yellow fever cards, etc. And we're standing in the queue trying to cross the border with immigration and 17 other regulators that are looking at different pages. And then next to me is a guy on a bike with a goat. No documents, free trade. My documents, an hour. Right? So, because these guys are already doing it. So when you talk about it, for businesses to thrive, if you don't engage those Africans who do free trade, continental free trade, who find a way of getting the Naira and Sefa to work, when our 32 central banks are struggling to do it, and nobody talks to them, then we become a joke. There's free trade. Policy is meant to make it fair. And we also have completely ignored the principle of business, which is there's a thin line between competition and collaboration. They all collaborated to sign a document, but nobody has factored competition. And every single country leader that was present at this conference and all the other conferences we go to is talking about, come to my country. My country is special. And by him telling me to come to his country, he's saying, ignore that other country. I was at an event yesterday, some people, and they said, oh, come to our country. And I said, no, I'm not coming. Right. And I was also talking to another person from another African country who says, why don't Nigerians care about my country? And I said, because we don't. And that's just the truth. You have to think about it. Competition means come to me, don't go to him. Collaboration means let's work together for the betterment of our collective people. How do I make that work? It is nowhere in any document. And that's where we need to start to think about. Get the Africans involved in African policy. Thank you.
Right. Thank you to the panelists, Jacques, Tara, Kadi, Stefano, and Farouk. Audience, please take this opportunity to ask them questions. These are our decision makers and deal makers on the continent. It's a once-in-a-year opportunity. Who would like to go first? The gentleman over there. Is there a mic in the room? Okay, I'll come to you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. My name is Caesar Mwangi. I'm from Nairobi. I heard the mention of Naivas, so I know Naivas very well. A quick question. Very practical question. Cocoa is grown in this country. You come to Nairobi, the chocolates come from Switzerland. This is absolutely ridiculous, and they're too expensive for us. How can we get, and it's a simple question, how can we just get cheaper chocolates in Nairobi from West Africa? Simple question.
Anybody else want to put through a question? I think we've got space maybe for two more, or anybody on the panel would like to answer that first, and then I'll go to the next question. Kadi, do you want to go? Tara, Jacques, Farouk, or even Stefano? You're welcome to answer that question. Why don't we have cheap chocolate in Africa when we produce so much cocoa? Kadi, do you want to go?
Because I'm Ivorian, I will try to answer that question. I think, first in Ivory Coast, the focus was on agriculture with our former president, Felix Houphouët-Boigny. So we produce cocoa, but the population of Côte d'Ivoire didn't eat chocolate at that time, at least. So for the Switzerland, for the European countries, it was really important to produce chocolate. And if you see, they use cocoa, but they also use a lot of ingredients in order to have that fancy chocolate. So the consumption of chocolate in Ivory Coast was quite low. People was not eating chocolate, so it was not a focus in terms of strategy to produce chocolate. Sorry, but now you see that there are some international companies who are here in Abidjan, and they are producing chocolate, and there are some local players, but it's a starter. We hope that going forward we'll have more manufacturing industry, but it's the evolution of the industry made the evolution of the consumption. Now that you have more urban Ivorian who are eating chocolate, it became a market. And you're right, we should have think across Africa, but I don't know if in Kenya 20 years ago people were eating chocolate. In Ivory Coast it was really some powder. It was not a consumption like in Europe, where it's very, people are really eating chocolate. Even in Abidjan, in Ivory Coast, it's still a urban consumption. But now that you have the demand, you have the manufacturing, and of course, it should be also like in other industry in Côte d'Ivoire, which is the main country in terms of cocoa production with Ghana here. You need to have the support of the government for those industries to grow up and to produce more chocolate for not only Africa, as you mentioned, and not only Côte d'Ivoire, as you mentioned, but for the whole continent.
Thank you, Kari, for that. We've got, okay, we're going to take these two. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Bonjour.
Good morning, everybody. I work for JCDECO in West and Central Africa. Apologies for speaking French. For our consultant, thank you for the interesting slides. This is a question on currency. Do we see patterns of inflation that are different, whether you are in the CFA region or in another region? And if it's the case, can you tell us more about the difference between these two currency areas?
My name is Sunday Ashade from Nigeria. I want to answer a little, then I'll ask us my question. I used to produce chocolate while I was in Calgary for some years back, about 10, 12 years back. I have to stop producing the chocolate because when I produce the chocolate, distribution of this product is not a product that people normally take much, and it goes into the outside environment. They are not, taking it into, because it requires a cooling area that you should keep it. It deteriorates. And at the end of the day, I was making losses. So at the end of the day, we pack it up, sell off all the equipment and stuff. But maybe now people are now eating chocolate. Maybe it's something we could look at. Then secondly, what I want to ask the panelists, I want to appreciate all your conversation. One of the key issues we have in manufacturing is raw materials. We spend a lot of forex importing raw materials that, if you look at the basic ingredients, they are available locally. What do we need to do to be able to ensure a good percentage? We need to look at some of the list of these raw materials we import. We import calcium carbonate, we import so many of them that the basic materials are available. How do we build that resources within Nigeria, within Africa, so that even if we want to move it from one location to the other, it will reduce the cost, to reduce what we spend as shipping and all that. And I think one of the good ways in which you can reduce cost to the client consumer is to want to see the basic raw materials. So what do we need to do to be able to improve this?
Thank you for that. Last question.
Thank you very much. I'm Frederick and I work for Jeune Afrique Media Group and I'm in charge of the Anglophone Africa. And I have a question for Farouk. Bouncing on your last comments about the Pan-African integration, etc. How do you see actually that proper integration within the FCFTA context? Should it start with a regional integration? And also, how do you see like the Francophone and the Anglophone world work together? Thank you.
Okay, Stéphane, and then Farouk, and we conclude.
Yes, thanks. So as you asked it in French, I'll take it in French. En fait, bon, tout d'abord, je suis pas un expert.
First of all, I'm not an expert, but when we were talking about inflation earlier on, I mentioned three drivers of inflation, and actually the different countries in Africa and the different areas have different impacts. If you look at the devaluation of currency, for example, in Nigeria, we have two exchange rates. We have a devaluation on the black market that is staggering. So this has a direct impact on inflation that will differ from the CFA area, which is rather stable in terms of its currency. On the issues tied to suppliers, this is something that is different from one market to the other. Logistics will affect a market differently from another one. If you also look at the production costs, the cost of electricity will vary whether you're in this country or in a different country. Fuel prices in the countries, absence of energy in some countries, like in South Africa where there's load shedding, there's 10 hours of blackouts daily. So this makes production difficult. So some markets are more exposed than others. So some markets in terms of their currency are more exposed by the decisions made by the European Central Bank or in the US because their currencies are more liquid, so there's arbitrage on RON, for example, depending on the decisions made by the FED. So we have different situations. And what we were hearing yesterday from the government of Cote d'Ivoire, they said that inflation was below 5% over the past 2 years, which is different from what you have in Nigeria or South Africa, which is closer to the figure 20% in Nigeria and 7-8% in SA. So this is the situation. These drivers affect markets differently, so impacts will differ as well.
Question from Jeune Afrique.
So the question was, what's the future of AFCFTA? Oh.
How do you piece together the different Africans, Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone?
Don't forget the tribes, right?
Yes.
you look at it. The honest answer is, I don't know. I think we have to study how, we have to officially, formally study how Africans move and interact with each other, as opposed to the theoretical expectations of how they should move and interact with each other. I mean, just Google a town called Ilara, I-L-A-R-A. It's on the border. It's a town literally between Nigeria and Benin. And there's a house whose living room is in Nigeria and toilet is in Benin Republic. And that is what happens as you move across borders. It's very difficult for you to say Gambia and Senegal, or Lesotho. So it has to be, let us study how our people move. How do they interact and engage each other first? And I think by doing that, we can now come back and formalize it, as opposed to creating a formal structure where many people, like I said, don't even have identification. So my own thinking is, we should learn from ourselves. We should learn from what makes us different, and we should learn from what brings us together. The successes that happen the successes that happen between border communities is trade-driven. The conflicts that happen within borders is tribal. You rarely hear cross-border conflicts that are linked to trade. Most of them are linked to tribal issues across the borders. This tribe is on this side, that tribe is on this side. They sell yams to each other. Some guy cheated, but they find a way of closing the trade. But that historical tribal conflict is what creates beef amongst ourselves, and that impacts trade. So my thinking is, as we do in our own group, we're constantly reviewing and understanding the psychology of the consumers, the psychology of our stakeholders, whether they're input suppliers and all those things, and then working to see how we can slightly move them closer to formalization. It will not happen overnight.
All right. Jacques, Tara, Kadi, Stefano, Farouk, I'd like to thank you for making the time for us, engaging us in this very informative conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a round of applause. We might have room for one more question. If there's a brave person here. Anyone? No?
I can comment on the localization, because there was a question around localization. And I think it's a huge opportunity in Africa, but unfortunately, what we do is we shoot ourselves in the foot. We dollar price our localization products. Government tax the local product as if it's imported, and then it falls flat. And we're starting protecting industries internally, and we need to create industries that's competitive and can be world-class. In my home country of South Africa, we've got a lot of examples of that. And I think there's a huge opportunity for corporates to work together across regions to build localized industries and support each other. Let's compete in the market with our products, but there's a lot that we can do backstream to make the continent a better place.
Right. Anybody else want to go briefly? Okay, I'll come to you.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that Farouk is actually raising a very good point. I'm Minister of Trade from Mozambique, and we've been discussing those things for a long time until we signed the agreement. But those things that you raised now are very, very, very deep. I think we need to think about that. It's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anybody else? Yes?
Okay, I think my question is for Tara. Would just really like to understand. I see that she does humanitarian and development. I want to understand how they partner in Nigeria, to support, obviously. So work that you do with farmers, obviously, is something that intersects with development. Where do you partner with private sector players to support others?
All right, where do you partner with farmers in Nigeria to support the private sector development as MasterCard?
So across the core business, we partner very broadly, I think, across Nigeria. We've got a goal to do financial inclusion to over 1 billion people by 2025, and I think we've already sort of smashed through those objectives. My specific business is around Community Pass, which is the digitization of the agricultural sector. We're not yet in Nigeria, but I hope after this that Farouk agrees to partner with us. Okay. Super. Then we'll be chatting afterwards. Yeah.
All right. That concludes our panel. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.